I remember exactly where I was standing when my husband said it. I was in our kitchen, the one I'd painted a soft cream color because he said bright whites hurt his eyes. The kettle was screaming on the stove, and I was already tired before the day had even begun. I'd been tired like that for years, but I didn't have words for it back then. I thought tired was just what long marriages felt like. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the polite smile he gave neighbors or the tight-lipped one he offered me across dinner plates. This one was wide, almost boyish, alive. And for half a second, something warm flickered in my chest because I thought, foolishly, that maybe that smile was for me. Then he said it. "I just found the love of my life." He didn't shout. He didn't whisper either. He said it like he was announcing good news, like he expected applause, like I was supposed to be happy for him. I laughed at first. It slipped out of me, sharp and confused, because my brain couldn't catch up to the words. I remember saying, "What?" in a tone that tried to sound playful, like this was a joke I just hadn't gotten yet. The kettle kept screaming. Neither of us moved to turn it off. He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "I didn't want to tell you like this," he said, which was a lie so casual it almost impressed me. "But I can't pretend anymore. I've met someone, and for the first time in my life, I understand what love really is." There are moments when time stretches thin, like you're watching your own life from a few feet behind your body. That's what it felt like then. I noticed the tiny crack in the corner of the ceiling we'd never fixed. I noticed the way my hands were shaking, how my wedding ring felt suddenly too heavy. I had been married to this man for 27 years. We had raised 2 children, buried a dog, mourned his mother together, built a life that looked solid from the outside, and in one sentence, he erased me from the center of it all. I asked him who she was, but my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, calm, controlled, almost curious. Inside, something primal was clawing its way up my throat. He told me her name. I won't say it here, not because she deserves protection, but because saying it still tastes bitter. He said they met through work, that it just happened, as if love were a pothole you accidentally drove into. He said she understood him, that she saw him, that she made him feel alive again. I remember thinking, I have been here this whole time. I have been seeing you. I have been holding the weight of this life with you, quietly, faithfully. But I didn't say any of that. I stood there barefoot on the kitchen tile and listened as he rewrote our history with the ease of a man who had already practiced the speech. He told me he hadn't planned to fall in love. That line still makes me shake my head. As if planning had anything to do with betrayal, as if intentions softened consequences. When I finally spoke, I asked him the one question that mattered to me then. How long? He hesitated just long enough to answer without lying outright. A few months. A few months. In a marriage that spanned nearly 3 decades, he reduced his deception to something small, almost reasonable. I later learned it had been longer. It's strange how the truth trickles in after the explosion, piece by piece, like shrapnel you keep finding under your skin. I turned off the kettle. The tea tasted like nothing when I finally drank it. That night, I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the man I loved breathe like nothing had changed. I kept waiting for tears, for rage, for something dramatic to pull me under. Instead, there was this hollow quiet inside me, like a room that had been emptied out while I wasn't looking. The next morning, he acted almost cheerful. He made coffee. He asked if I wanted toast. The normalcy felt cruel. I realized then that he had already left the marriage emotionally. I was just catching up. Over the next few days, he explained himself repeatedly, as if repetition would make it kinder. He said he didn't want to hurt me. He said he deserved happiness. He said life was too short to stay somewhere you didn't feel fulfilled. Each sentence landed like a small slap, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they erased. All the years I had stayed when things were hard, all the ways I had bent and softened to make our life work. I started replaying our marriage in my head, searching for the moment I must have lost him. Had I become boring, too practical, too quiet? I thought about the nights I fell asleep alone while he stayed up working, the weekends he suddenly needed space, the way he'd flinch when I touched his arm. I had noticed it all, filed it away under excuses, told myself marriage had seasons. No one tells you how much shame comes with being left like this. Even when you've done nothing wrong, you start to feel defective, replaceable, like a draft version that finally got deleted. When I told our children, my hands shook worse than they had in the kitchen. They were grown, living their own lives, but in that moment, I felt like I was failing them all over again. My daughter cried. My son went silent, his jaw tight. Neither of them asked why. They asked how I was. That broke me more than the betrayal itself. At night, when the house finally went quiet, I walked from room to room, touching the furniture like it might disappear. Every object held a memory: the couch where we watched old movies, the dining table where birthdays happened, the bed where I had believed, foolishly, that love meant permanence. He moved into the guest room a week later. He said it was temporary. Everything was temporary, according to him, except his love for her. I caught myself wondering what she had that I didn't. Was she younger, lighter, less worn down by years of responsibility? The comparisons came whether I invited them or not, and every time they left me feeling smaller. But somewhere under the grief, something else began to stir, a quiet, unfamiliar question. If he could declare the love of his life while still married to me, what did that say about the story I'd been telling myself all these years? About sacrifice, about endurance, about what love was supposed to look like? I wasn't ready to answer that yet. I was still standing in the wreckage, holding pieces of a life that no longer fit together. But the seed was planted, whether I liked it or not. Because when someone tells you shamelessly that they found the love of their life and it isn't you, something cracks open. And through that crack, the truth has a way of creeping in. The days after his confession blurred together in a way that still feels unreal when I look back. I went to work, answered emails, smiled at coworkers who had no idea my marriage had quietly detonated in my kitchen. I learned how to function while hollow, how to hold conversations while my mind replayed his words over and over. I just found the love of my life. Every time I heard it, something inside me recoiled, like my body was rejecting a poison it didn't know how to process. He started coming home later, not because he was hiding anymore, but because he no longer felt the need to pretend. That shift hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. The secrecy had been painful, but the openness was worse. He talked about her casually, carelessly, as if I were a neutral party. He said she liked hiking, that she cooked differently than I did, that she laughed at his jokes. Each detail felt like salt pressed into an open wound. One evening, he told me he was going to stay out overnight. He didn't ask, he informed me. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do, and then I went into the bathroom and sat on the floor until the tiles went cold under my legs. That was the first time I cried so hard I scared myself. It wasn't dramatic sobbing, it was the kind of crying that empties you out, leaves your chest aching and your head pounding, like grief had physical weight. I remember thinking, this is what abandonment feels like. Not a door slamming, not a screaming fight, just the slow realization that the person you trusted most has chosen a different life and you are not invited. The next morning, I woke up alone in our bed and felt something shift. The sadness was still there, heavy and thick, but underneath it was anger. Quiet at first, then sharper. Anger at him for his cruelty. Anger at myself for accepting scraps of affection for so long. Anger at the way I'd made myself smaller to keep peace. I started noticing things I'd ignored for years, how often I apologized even when I wasn't wrong, how I deferred to his preferences automatically, like muscle memory, how rarely I asked myself what I wanted. It was unsettling, like waking up to find you'd been living someone else's life. He came home later that day, smelling faintly of a different soap. I asked him, calmly, if he planned to leave. He looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for me to say it. "I think that would be best," he said. Best for who? I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. We talked logistics after that. Money, the house, how to tell extended family. The conversations were surreal, businesslike. Every now and then he'd pause and say he was sorry, his voice rehearsed and distant. I realized then that his apologies were more about easing his own discomfort than addressing my pain. When he finally moved out, the house felt too quiet. I walked through it again, but this time the silence wasn't just grief. It was space. Empty, yes, but also open. That scared me more than anything else. Friends rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. They brought food, sent texts, sat with me while I stared into space. Some of them admitted they'd never liked him much. Others were shocked. Everyone had an opinion, advice, a theory. I listened politely and then went home and sat with my own thoughts because no one else could live inside them with me. At night, I dreamed of our early years, the man he used to be, or maybe the man I believed he was. I woke up with that familiar ache of missing someone who no longer existed. It took me a while to understand that grief isn't always about loss. Sometimes it's about disillusionment. One afternoon, my daughter came over unannounced. She found me folding laundry and burst into tears, apologizing over and over, like this was somehow her fault. I held her and felt something fierce rise in me, a protective instinct not just for her, but for myself. I didn't want her growing up believing that love meant enduring disrespect. I didn't want her thinking that being chosen once meant you owed someone your entire life, even if they stopped choosing you. That night after she left, I stood in front of the mirror and really looked at myself. Not the version filtered through my husband's indifference, not the reflection shaped by years of compromise. Just me. I looked older than I felt, tired, but there was something else there too. A steadiness, a resilience I hadn't acknowledged. I started doing small things differently. I changed my morning routine, took longer walks, cooked meals he'd never liked just because I did. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of reclamation. Each choice reminded me that I still existed outside of being someone's wife. He called often at first, sometimes to discuss practical matters, sometimes just to talk. I let those calls go to voicemail more and more. I wasn't being cruel, I was protecting the fragile boundary I was building. Every conversation with him reopened wounds I was trying to let heal. One day, he told me she wanted to meet me. He said it like it was reasonable, even kind. I laughed, a bitter sound I didn't recognize as my own. "No," I said, clearly. For once, I didn't soften it. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. The relief I felt afterwards surprised me. As weeks turned into months, the shock dulled, replaced by a quieter sadness and a growing clarity. I began to see our marriage without nostalgia's haze. I saw how often my needs had gone unmet, how his happiness had always taken precedence, how I'd been loyal not just to him, but to an idea of marriage that demanded silence and sacrifice. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. If I hadn't been wrong for him, maybe the marriage itself had simply run its course. Maybe love wasn't supposed to feel like erasure. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with colors I hadn't noticed in years. I felt lonely, deeply so, but I also felt present, awake. I thought about the sentence that had started it all, the one that had shattered my life. I just found the love of my life. For the first time, I wondered if maybe that sentence, as devastating as it was also a catalyst. Because in losing him, I was beginning to find something else, a sense of self I'd misplaced somewhere along the way, a quiet strength that didn't need validation, a future that, while uncertain, was mine to shape. I wasn't healed, not even close, but I was no longer standing still in the wreckage. I was moving, slowly, deliberately, towards something new, and that mattered more than I had ever imagined. The first time I slept through the night without waking up crying, I didn't even realize it had happened until morning. I opened my eyes and lay there for a few seconds, confused by the quiet inside my chest. The grief was still there, but it hadn't dragged me under in my sleep. That small mercy felt like progress, even if I didn't yet trust it to last. I started therapy around that time, mostly because everyone told me I should. I walked into that office carrying decades of unspoken compromise, unsure where to begin. When the therapist asked me why I was there, the words came out simple and raw. My husband left me and said he found the love of his life. Saying it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. She nodded gently and asked, "And how did that make you feel about yourself?" That question cracked something open. I had spent so much time focusing on what he'd done, what he'd chosen, that I hadn't really examined what it had done to me. The shame, the self-doubt, the way I'd started questioning my own worth. Therapy wasn't a miracle cure, but it gave me language for feelings I'd buried for years. It taught me that my pain didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was human. Around that same time, he stopped calling as much. At first, that stung. Even betrayal has its own strange gravity. But as the silence stretched, I felt lighter, less tethered. I realized how much emotional energy I'd spent anticipating his moods, his needs, his approval. Without that constant pull, I had room to breathe. I began reconnecting with parts of myself I'd neglected. I dug out an old journal from my 20s and reread entries from a woman who dreamed loudly and unapologetically. She wanted to travel, to write, to live somewhere near water. I barely recognized her, but I felt a tenderness toward that younger version of me. She hadn't known how much she'd give away, how long it would take to find herself again. One weekend, I took a short trip by myself. Nothing dramatic, just a small coastal town a few hours away. I checked into a modest hotel, walked along the shore, listened to the waves without having to accommodate anyone else's pace or preferences. I ate dinner alone, slowly, watching the sun disappear into the horizon. I felt lonely, yes, but I also felt free in a way I hadn't in years. It was there, standing barefoot in the sand, that I understood something important. My marriage hadn't failed because I wasn't enough. It had failed because we stopped growing in the same direction. I had mistaken endurance for love, loyalty for fulfillment, and while those things have value, they can't replace mutual respect and choice. When I returned home, the house didn't feel quite as empty. I rearranged furniture, donated clothes I no longer wore, made the space reflect who I was becoming instead of who I had been. Each change felt symbolic, like I was gently but firmly reclaiming territory. He reached out again a few weeks later, asking if we could talk. I agreed, but only on my terms. We met in a neutral place, a quiet cafe where the smell of coffee lingered in the air. He looked different, lighter maybe, or maybe I was just seeing him without the lens of hope. He talked about his new life, his happiness. I listened, not because I needed to know, but because I wanted to see how it felt. To my surprise, it didn't devastate me. It clarified things. This was his path. It no longer intersected with mine. When it was my turn to speak, I told him how deeply his words had hurt me, not just the betrayal, but the casual way he'd dismissed our history. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I spoke calmly, clearly, with a strength I didn't know I possessed. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even remorseful, but I wasn't there for his regret. I was there for my closure. I told him I was letting go, not forgiving in the neat, tidy way people like to talk about, but releasing the hold his choices had on my sense of self. I told him he hoped he found whatever he was searching for, and that I was doing the same. When we stood to leave, I felt a surprising sense of finality, a door closing gently instead of slamming. Life didn't suddenly become easy after that. There were still days when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the familiarity of partnership, the comfort of shared history, but those moments no longer defined me. They passed like waves, leaving behind something steadier. I started volunteering at a local community center, something I'd always wanted to do but never found time for. I met people with stories far heavier than mine, and it put my pain into perspective without diminishing it. It reminded me that resilience often grows quietly in shared humanity. Around that same time, my children noticed the change before I did. My daughter told me one day, "You seem lighter, Mom." My son said he admired how I handled everything. Their words filled a place inside me I hadn't realized was empty. I wasn't just surviving this, I was modeling something important: self-respect, healing, the courage to start again. One evening, months after that sentence had shattered my world, I sat alone with a cup of tea, the same kettle now humming softly instead of screaming. I thought about love, about how narrowly I'd defined it for so long. I realized that real love doesn't announce itself by erasing someone else. It doesn't demand silence or sacrifice without reciprocity. It doesn't make you feel invisible in your own life. I didn't know what the future held. I still don't. But I knew this: I was no longer waiting for someone else to choose me. I was choosing myself, day by day, with intention and care. And that choice, quiet as it was, felt like the beginning of a different kind of love story, one rooted not in betrayal, but in truth. There was a moment, somewhere between the first full year without him and the second, when I realized I had stopped measuring time by the day he left. The anniversary passed quietly, almost unnoticed, and when I recognized it afterward, I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Not because I missed him, but because I finally understood how deeply that wound had once defined me, and now it didn't. Life had settled into a new rhythm, not the kind that felt exciting or dramatic, but one that felt steady, honest. I woke up without that familiar weight on my chest, the one that had followed me around like a shadow for years. Some mornings were still heavy, especially the quiet ones, but the heaviness no longer felt permanent. I started saying no more often. No to obligations that drained me, no to conversations that felt performative, no to carrying emotional loads that weren't mine. At first, it felt selfish. That old voice inside me, the one trained by decades of compromise, whispered that I was being difficult. But the more I honored my boundaries, the quieter that voice became. I ran into him unexpectedly one afternoon at the grocery store. He was with her. I recognized her immediately, even though we'd never met. She was younger than me, but not in the way that movies dramatize. She had kind eyes, a nervous smile. For a split second, I felt the old ache rise up, sharp and familiar. Then it passed. They looked surprised to see me, like they hadn't considered the possibility that our worlds might still overlap. He introduced us awkwardly. She said my name like it was fragile. I nodded, polite, calm, and excused myself. I walked away with my head high, my heart racing but intact. Later, in the car, I sat and breathed until the adrenaline faded. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I drove home and cooked dinner and slept just fine. That was the moment I knew I was truly moving forward. I began to understand that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without bleeding. It's about letting experiences become part of your story without allowing them to dictate the ending. The betrayal would always be a chapter, but it no longer got to be the whole book. I invested more deeply in friendships, the kind that had quietly sustained me through everything. Women who listened without judgment, who laughed with me about small, ridiculous things, who reminded me of who I was before I became someone's wife. We traveled together, took classes together, shared meals that stretched late into the night. There was a richness there I hadn't known I was missing. I also learned to sit with myself, truly sit. No distractions, no noise, just me and my thoughts. At first, that was uncomfortable. Silence has a way of bringing everything you've avoided to the surface. But over time, I found peace in it. I learned to trust my own company. Every now and then, someone would ask if I was dating again. The question always came with a careful tone, like they were handling something delicate. I would smile and say, "Not yet." And I meant it. I wasn't closed off to love, but I wasn't chasing it either. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel incomplete on my own. I thought often about the sentence that had started it all. I just found the love of my life. I wondered if he still believed that, if the novelty had worn off, if the reality of daily life had set in. But those thoughts no longer consumed me. They drifted in and out like passing clouds, leaving the sky unchanged. What mattered more was the lesson I carried forward, that love isn't proven by endurance alone, that loyalty to yourself is just as important as loyalty to others, that staying silent to keep peace often costs more than leaving ever could. One evening, as I was cleaning out an old drawer, I found a stack of letters he'd written me early in our marriage, promises, declarations, dreams we'd shared. I sat on the floor and read them slowly. There was no anger this time, just a quiet gratitude for what had been, and an acceptance of what no longer was. I folded them neatly and put them back, not because I needed them, but because they were part of my history, and I no longer needed to erase it to move on. I started writing more, journaling my thoughts, capturing moments of clarity and confusion alike. Writing became a way to honor my experience without being swallowed by it. It reminded me that my voice mattered, that my perspective had value beyond anyone else's validation. There were still nights when loneliness crept in, when the house felt too big and too quiet. But instead of fearing those moments, I learned to greet them with compassion. Loneliness wasn't a failure. It was a reminder of my capacity to love, to connect, to hope. And that capacity was still very much alive. I realized something else, too. The version of me who had been blindsided in that kitchen wasn't weak or foolish. She was trusting. She believed in commitment, in shared futures, in working through hard things. Those weren't flaws. They were strengths that had simply been misplaced. As another year drew to a close, I stood in front of the mirror again, just as I had after my daughter's visit long ago. This time, The woman looking back at me seemed familiar, grounded, whole, not because life had gone according to plan, but because I had learned how to adapt when it didn't. I no longer defined myself by being chosen or left. I defined myself by how I showed up for my own life, by the courage it took to rebuild, by the grace I extended to myself when things fell apart. And in that quiet understanding, I felt something settle into place, a sense of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions, a love that wasn't loud or dramatic, but steady and real. I didn't need someone to announce they'd found the love of their life anymore, because I was living mine, slowly, intentionally, on my own terms. By the time the 3rd year after my marriage ended arrived, I had stopped introducing myself as someone who'd been divorced. The word no longer felt like a defining feature of my identity. It was a fact, yes, but not the headline of my story. That shift felt subtle on the surface, but inside it marked a profound change. I was no longer orienting my life around what had been lost. I was building something new. I noticed it first in the way I made decisions. I didn't consult an imaginary version of him in my head anymore. I didn't weigh my choices against what someone else might prefer. I chose freely, intuitively, guided by my own values and desires. That freedom was intoxicating in its quiet way. I downsized the house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The old place had held too many echoes. I found a smaller home with large windows and a garden that needed care. Digging my hands into the soil felt grounding, almost symbolic. I was tending to something alive, something that responded to patience and attention. Watching things grow reminded me that time doesn't just take things away, it gives too. I became closer with my neighbors, people I might never have spoken to deeply before. We shared stories over fences, exchanged small favors, looked out for one another. Community, I learned, doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it's built in quiet, consistent ways. It was around then that I met someone new. Not in a dramatic, fate-filled way, just a conversation at a bookstore, a shared recommendation, a coffee that followed naturally. I wasn't searching, and because of that, I wasn't trying to impress or mold myself into something else. I showed up as I was. There was no rush, no intensity that felt overwhelming, just curiosity, respect, and ease. And that, more than anything, told me how much I had changed. I knew now that love didn't need to be urgent to be meaningful. As the relationship unfolded slowly, I remained attentive to myself. I noticed how I felt around him, whether I felt smaller or more expansive, whether my boundaries were respected without explanation. Those observations mattered more to me than declarations or promises. One evening, we talked about past relationships. When he asked about my marriage, I told him the truth, but I didn't dwell there. I spoke without bitterness, without self-pity. He listened carefully, without trying to fix or analyze. That moment told me more about his character than any grand gesture could have. Still, I didn't lose myself in the possibility of something new. I maintained my routines, my friendships, my solitude. I knew now that love should add to a life, not replace it. That lesson had been hard won, and I wasn't willing to forget it. Occasionally, I heard news about my ex through mutual acquaintances, bits and pieces, nothing dramatic, just life continuing as it always does. Those updates no longer stirred strong emotions. They felt distant, like stories about people I used to know. What surprised me most was the compassion I eventually felt toward him, not because his actions were justified, but because I no longer needed to hold on to anger to protect myself. I could acknowledge the harm without carrying it forward. That, I realized, was a form of freedom. I reflected often on the woman I had been at the beginning of this journey, the one standing in the kitchen, blindsided and shaking. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she would survive, that she would rediscover joy, that the pain, while real and devastating, would not be the end of her story. Instead, I honored her by living fully now, by choosing honesty, by trusting myself again. There were moments when the old fear surfaced, when vulnerability felt risky, but I reminded myself that closing off wasn't the same as being safe. Real safety came from knowing I could handle whatever came next, that I had the tools, the resilience, the self-respect to face uncertainty without losing myself. One afternoon, as I sat in my garden watching the light shift, I thought again about that sentence, the one that had once felt like a verdict. I just found the love of my life. It no longer haunted me. It felt neutral, almost irrelevant. Because the most important realization of all had quietly taken root over time. Love isn't something someone else grants you. It isn't validated by being chosen. It's cultivated within through self-knowledge, compassion, and courage. And when shared with someone else, it should feel like a partnership, not a performance, a choice made daily, not a declaration made once. As the plants swayed gently in the breeze, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for what it revealed, for the life it pushed me to build, for the clarity it forced upon me. I didn't know exactly where the path ahead would lead, but I trusted myself to walk it with intention and grace, and that trust, hard-earned and deeply felt, was something no one could ever take from me again. There was a quiet confidence that settled into me during that season of my life, one I didn't announce or explain to anyone. It showed up in small ways, in how I walked into rooms without scanning for approval, in how I spoke without apologizing for taking up space, in how I trusted my instincts without second-guessing them. This confidence wasn't loud or flashy. It was rooted, earned through loss and reflection. The relationship I had begun to explore continued at its own gentle pace. We shared time, not urgency. Conversations stretched long, filled with curiosity rather than expectation. And when disagreements surfaced, as they inevitably do, they didn't feel like threats. They felt like opportunities to understand each other better. That alone told me I was no longer repeating old patterns. I paid close attention to how my body responded to this new connection. There was no tightness in my chest, no anxiety-driven need to please. I didn't feel the urge to abandon myself to maintain harmony. Instead, I felt steady, equal, seen but not consumed. It was unfamiliar, and for a while I didn't trust it. Peace can feel suspicious when you've grown used to tension. One night, as we sat together quietly, he asked me something simple. What makes you feel most like yourself? The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years defining myself in relation to others that I hadn't considered that answer deeply. I thought for a moment and then said, when I'm honest, even when it's uncomfortable. Saying it out loud felt like a promise I was making to myself. Around that time, I began speaking more openly about my experience, not just with close friends, but in writing. I shared pieces of my story anonymously at first, unsure how it would be received. The response surprised me. Messages from women who saw themselves in my words, who had been silenced by loyalty, who had mistaken endurance for love. Their stories echoed mine in ways that made me feel less alone, less foolish. I realized then that betrayal carries a unique isolation. People are uncomfortable with it. They want neat resolutions, quick forgiveness, clean endings. But real healing is messy. It loops back on itself. It asks hard questions without offering immediate answers. Sharing that truth felt important, necessary. I was invited to speak at a small community gathering about resilience and rebuilding after loss. I almost said no. The old fear of visibility crept in. But something inside me said yes. Standing there, looking out at unfamiliar faces, I spoke from the heart, not as an expert, but as someone who had lived it. I talked about grief, about identity, about the courage it takes to let go of a life you thought was permanent. Afterward, a woman approached me, her eyes wet with tears. She said, "I thought something was wrong with me because I wasn't over it yet." I took her hands and told her the truth. There's nothing wrong with you. Healing doesn't follow a schedule. In that moment, I understood that my pain had become something else, a bridge, a way to connect. Meanwhile, my ex became less present in my thoughts, not because I was actively pushing him away, but because my life was full again. I had things to look forward to, projects that mattered, relationships that felt mutual. When memories surfaced, they no longer carried the same charge. They were just memories. I did, however, have one last conversation with him that I hadn't anticipated. He reached out unexpectedly, asking if we could talk. There was a hesitancy in his voice I hadn't heard before. We met briefly, and for the first time I saw him clearly, not as the man who had broken my heart, but as someone grappling with his own choices. He told me things hadn't turned out the way he had imagined, that life was more complicated than the fantasy he had chased. I listened without judgment, without satisfaction. His regrets were his to carry. I didn't feel responsible for soothing them. When he asked if I was happy, I answered honestly. "I am," I said, and I meant it, not because everything was perfect, but because I was aligned with myself. That conversation didn't reopen old wounds. It closed a door gently, finally. As I walked away, I felt a deep sense of completion, not closure in the cinematic sense, but something quieter and more real. Acceptance. I thought back to the woman I'd been before all of this, the one who believed being chosen once meant you would always be chosen, the one who thought love was something you proved by staying. I felt compassion for her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. Now I knew more. I knew that love should feel safe, that it should invite growth, not demand sacrifice at the expense of self, that the most important relationship I would ever have was the one I cultivated with myself. On a quiet morning, I sat with a cup of tea, sunlight filtering through the windows of my smaller, truer home. I felt a sense of gratitude so deep it surprised me, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it forced, for the path it opened, for the woman it revealed. My story hadn't ended when my husband said he'd found the love of his life. It had begun again, and this time I was the one writing it. As the years continued to unfold, I became increasingly aware of how differently I moved through the world. Not just emotionally, but physically. My shoulders were no longer hunched forward, bracing for disappointment. I laughed more easily. I listened more deeply. I trusted the quiet signals my body sent me, the ones I'd ignored for so long while trying to keep a marriage intact. The relationship I had been exploring settled into something comfortable and honest, not because we declared it so, but because it felt that way in the day-to-day moments, grocery shopping together, sitting in companionable silence, disagreeing without fear. I noticed how my nervous system stayed calm around him, how I didn't feel the need to perform or anticipate his needs before he voiced them. That ease felt like a small miracle. But even as I allowed space for love again, I remained rooted in myself. I kept my own home, my own routines, my own inner compass. There was no illusion that another person would complete me. I had already done that work. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sky darken, he said something that stayed with me. "You don't seem afraid of being alone." I smiled and told him the truth. I was, for a long time, but now I know I can survive it. And that changes everything. That was the difference. Love, when it came from fear, had once made me cling. Love, now grounded in self-trust, allowed me to choose freely, to stay because I wanted to, not because I was afraid of what leaving would mean. I continued speaking and writing, sharing my story more openly, not for validation, but because I knew how isolating betrayal can feel. I received messages from people who were standing exactly where I had once stood, in kitchens and bedrooms and quiet moments of realization. They asked me how I got through it, how I rebuilt, how I trusted again. I never gave them a neat formula because there wasn't one. I told them the truth, that healing takes time, that it's uneven and often uncomfortable, that some days you feel strong and others you feel like you're starting over, and that all of it counts. I emphasized one thing above all else, that their worth was not defined by someone else's inability to choose you, that love leaving does not mean love was never real, but it does mean it changed, and that change, painful as it is, can lead to growth if you let it. I watched my children step further into their own adult lives, making choices with more awareness, more intention. I saw how my journey had shaped them, not through the pain itself, but through how I handled it, through the example of resilience and self-respect. That knowledge filled me with a quiet pride. There were moments, still, when old memories surfaced unexpectedly, a song, a place, a familiar phrase, but they no longer knocked the wind out of me. They passed through, acknowledged, and released. I had learned that healing doesn't erase the past, it integrates it. On the anniversary of my divorce, I did something symbolic. I took a long walk alone, somewhere quiet and beautiful. I brought no distractions, no music, no phone, just my thoughts and the steady rhythm of my steps. I reflected on everything that had led me there, the shock, the grief, the rebuilding, the growth. I thanked the version of myself who had survived the worst of it, who had gotten out of bed when it hurt, who had faced the truth instead of clinging to illusion, who had chosen honesty over comfort even when it cost her everything she thought she knew. That walk felt like a closing ceremony, not because the journey was over, but because a chapter had truly ended. Later that evening, I received a message from someone who had listened to my story. She wrote that she was sitting in her car, crying, because for the first time she felt seen, that she had been blaming herself for her partner's betrayal and didn't know how to move forward. I wrote back gently, reminding her of something I had learned the hard way, that someone else's choices are a reflection of their capacity, not your value. As I sent that message, I realized something profound. My pain had been transformed into purpose, not in a grand, performative way, but in a deeply human one. It allowed me to reach others from a place of authenticity and understanding. I no longer felt defined by what had been done to me. I felt defined by how I had responded, with honesty, with courage, with compassion for myself and others. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection again. It struck me how familiar she felt now, how grounded, how whole. I smiled softly, not out of pride, but out of recognition. This was the woman I had been becoming all along. I thought again about the sentence that once shattered my world. I'd just found the love of my life. It had lost its power over me completely. It was no longer a wound or a trigger. It was simply part of the story that led me here. And here was a place of clarity, of choice, of quiet joy. I knew now that love doesn't arrive to rescue you. It arrives to meet you where you already stand. And the most important love you will ever cultivate is the one that teaches you to stand there with confidence and grace. That understanding settled into me like a deep, steady breath, and I carried it forward into whatever chapters still awaited. There's a particular kind of peace that comes not from everything going right, but from knowing you will be all right, even when things don't. That was the peace I lived in now. It didn't make life perfect, it made it manageable, meaningful, and real. I noticed it in moments that once would have unsettled me. A disagreement that didn't escalate, a plan that changed unexpectedly, a quiet weekend with no agenda. Instead of anxiety, I felt flexibility. Instead of fear, curiosity. I had learned how to stay present without bracing for impact. The relationship I was in continued to grow, but never at the expense of my independence. We moved carefully, respectfully, honoring each other's lives rather than merging them prematurely. I had learned that closeness doesn't require collapse, that intimacy can exist alongside autonomy. One evening, we talked about the future, not in grand declarations, but in gentle possibilities. What might come, what might not. I didn't feel the need to secure anything in that moment. The absence of urgency felt like a gift. Whatever happened next, I knew I would be okay. I found myself becoming more selective about where I placed my energy. I no longer chased connections that felt one-sided or draining. I didn't explain my boundaries excessively or apologize for them. That shift alone changed the quality of my relationships. I also became more patient with myself. Healing had taught me that growth isn't linear. Some days I still felt echoes of the past. Old doubts would whisper. But instead of spiraling, I met those moments with kindness. I reminded myself how far I'd come. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I came across pictures from early in my marriage. There we were, young and hopeful, unaware of the years ahead. I studied my own face in those images, the openness, the trust. I felt no urge to judge her. She had loved fully. That mattered. I realized then that betrayal does not erase the love that existed before it. It changes it, reframes it, but it doesn't make it meaningless. And understanding that allowed me to hold my past with compassion instead of resentment. I continued to hear from people who resonated with my story. Some were angry, some were numb, some were terrified of starting over. I never minimized their pain. I told them the truth. That rebuilding is hard, that it requires you to sit with discomfort instead of rushing toward distraction. But I also told them that there is strength on the other side they cannot yet imagine. I often thought about how differently I would have handled things if I had stayed, if I had swallowed the betrayal and tried to preserve the marriage at any cost. I understood now that staying would have required me to abandon myself, and that was a price I was no longer willing to pay. One evening, my daughter asked me a question that surprised me. "Do you think things happen the way they were supposed to?" I considered it carefully before answering. "I don't believe in things being supposed to happen," I said. "I believe we make meaning out of what happens." She nodded, thoughtful. I could see her absorbing that truth, shaping it into her own understanding of relationships. As time went on, I felt increasingly aligned with my life, not because it matched some ideal, but because it felt honest. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't performing roles that no longer fit. I was simply living. I returned to that coastal town I'd visited alone years earlier. This time, I walked the shore with a lighter heart. I remembered how fragile I'd felt then, how uncertain. Standing there now, I felt grounded, capable. I smiled at the memory of that earlier version of myself, grateful for her courage. I sat on the sand and let the waves wash over my feet, thinking about how much had changed since that day in the kitchen, how a single sentence had dismantled everything I thought I knew, and how, slowly, deliberately, I had built something new from the pieces. I thought about love again, how much my understanding of it had expanded. Love wasn't just romance or partnership, it was integrity, it was honesty, it was the willingness to face hard truths rather than live in comfortable illusions. I had learned that real love begins with how you treat yourself when no one is watching, how you speak to yourself in moments of failure or fear, how you honor your needs even when it's inconvenient. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft hues, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought, for the strength it revealed, for the life it pushed me to claim. I stood and brushed the sand from my clothes, ready to return to the life I had built, a life rooted in choice, in self-respect, in truth. And as I walked away from the shore, I knew with certainty that no matter what came next, I would meet it whole, not waiting to be chosen, already standing in my own worth. By the time I reached this point in my life, I had stopped asking why things happened the way they did. That question had exhausted itself. It had circled my mind for years, demanding answers no one could give me. Instead, I found myself asking a different question, one that felt far more grounding. What am I doing with what happened? That shift changed everything. I noticed how often people around me were still living inside stories that hurt them. Old betrayals, old regrets, old versions of themselves they no longer recognized. I didn't judge them. I understood them. I had lived there too. But I also knew now that staying trapped in the why could quietly steal years of your life. I had learned to anchor myself in the present, in what was real, tangible, and within my control. The present was where my power lived. The relationship I was in continued, but it never became the center of my identity. We chose each other repeatedly, consciously, without obligation. And that choice felt meaningful precisely because it wasn't guaranteed. We talked openly about fears, expectations, and boundaries. Nothing was assumed. Everything was discussed. That transparency felt like oxygen. There were moments when vulnerability scared me, when opening my heart again felt risky. But I reminded myself that the goal was not to avoid pain at all costs. The goal was to live fully, honestly, even if that meant sometimes getting hurt. Avoidance, I had learned, is not the same as safety. One afternoon, while sitting with a close friend, she asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever regret leaving?" I thought about it carefully. I thought about the life I might have lived if I had stayed, the quiet resentment, the erosion of self, the constant shrinking, and I shook my head. "No," I said, "I regret how long I ignored myself." That truth landed heavily between us. It was one I wished more people felt allowed to say. I began to see my story not as one of abandonment, but of awakening. Pain had been the catalyst, yes, but awareness was the result. And awareness, once gained, cannot be undone. I also forgave myself for the years I stayed silent, for the times I accepted less than I deserved. I understood now that I hadn't been weak. I had been hopeful. I had believed in love, in commitment, in the power of patience. Those beliefs were not foolish. They were simply incomplete. As time went on, my ex became a distant figure in my life. Not erased, not vilified, just distant. Someone who had once played a significant role, but no longer held emotional authority over me. When I thought of him now, it was with neutrality, and that neutrality felt like freedom. I spent more time doing things that nourished me, reading, walking, creating, sitting quietly with my thoughts without needing to escape them. I learned how to enjoy my own presence in a way I never had before. One evening, I hosted a small dinner for friends. We laughed, shared stories, lingered long after the dishes were cleared. As I looked around the table, I felt something warm settle in my chest. This was connection. This was belonging, and it had nothing to do with marriage or status or being chosen by one person. It had everything to do with authenticity. Later that night, alone in my kitchen, I paused. The same kitchen where my world had once shattered. I stood in the same spot, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet of the house. The memory surfaced, but it no longer hurt. It felt like standing in a place where a storm had passed, the air clean and still. I placed my hand on the counter and whispered a quiet thank you. Not to him, to myself, for surviving, for growing, for refusing to let that moment define the rest of my life. I realized then that the most powerful thing I had done was not rebuilding my life, it was reclaiming my voice, speaking my truth, trusting my instincts, choosing honesty over comfort. The sentence that once felt like a verdict had become just a line in a longer story, a story about resilience, about self-discovery, about the courage it takes to start again when everything familiar falls away. I no longer measured my worth by whether someone stayed. I measured it by how deeply I stayed true to myself. And that shift changed the way I loved, the way I lived, the way I showed up in the world. As I turned off the lights that night and headed to bed, I felt a quiet certainty settle in me. Whatever came next, I would meet it with clarity, with boundaries, with compassion, with strength. My life was no longer defined by betrayal. It was defined by choice. And that, more than anything else, felt like freedom. There is a moment, somewhere deep in the aftermath of betrayal, when you stop asking to be saved and start asking to be honest. Honest with yourself. Honest about what you tolerated. Honest about what you deserve. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment marked the true beginning of my healing. I used to think the hardest part of my story was the day my husband said, "I just found the love of my life." I thought that sentence was the deepest cut, but now I understand something different. The hardest part wasn't hearing those words. It was realizing how long I had lived without hearing my own. For years, I had quieted myself, softened my needs, explained away my loneliness. I had told myself that love meant patience, that loyalty meant endurance, that staying was noble even when it hurt. And while those beliefs came from a good place, they also kept me small. When my marriage ended, it didn't just take my partner with it, it stripped away the illusion I had been living under. And in that raw, exposed place, I was finally forced to see myself clearly. I saw a woman who had given deeply, loved sincerely, and believed wholeheartedly. I also saw a woman who had ignored her intuition, who had confused consistency with connection, and who had waited far too long to ask for more. Holding both of those truths at once was painful, but it was also liberating. I stopped needing my ex to understand my pain. I stopped needing an apology that would never fully heal what was broken. I stopped needing the past to make sense in order to move forward. Closure, I learned, is not something someone else gives you, it's something you claim. I claimed it quietly, in the way I chose peace over proving a point, in the way I refused to speak badly about him, not because he didn't deserve criticism, but because I didn't want to carry bitterness any longer, in the way I redirected my energy back to my own life. I also learned that forgiveness is not a performance. It doesn't require reconciliation or forgetting. Sometimes forgiveness is simply releasing the hope that the past could have been different. Sometimes it's saying, "This hurt me, and I'm still choosing to move forward." The love I have now in my life, whether romantic, platonic, or internal, feels different from anything I knew before. It is not fueled by fear. It does not demand sacrifice as proof. It does not require me to disappear. It feels mutual, respectful, calm. And most importantly, it feels honest. If there is one thing I wish I could tell every person standing where I once stood, it is this. Someone else's inability to choose you does not mean you are unlovable. Someone else's decision to leave does not erase the years you gave or the love you offered. It simply reveals that the relationship could not grow where it was planted. You are not foolish for believing in love. You are not weak for staying as long as you did. You are not broken because your heart shattered. You are human, and humans heal. I no longer see my story as one of abandonment. I see it as a turning point, a moment when the life I had carefully built fell apart so that a truer one could take its place. That kind of transformation is never gentle, but it is powerful. Today, when I stand in my kitchen, it feels like a different place entirely, not because the walls changed, but because I did. The memory still exists, but it no longer defines me. It no longer echoes. It no longer hurts. That sentence that once devastated me has lost its meaning. I just found the love of my life. It turned out he was right. He did find the love of his life. And so did I. I just had to lose him to find myself. And if you're listening to this while standing in your own moment of heartbreak, confusion, or reckoning, I want you to know something. You are not at the end of your story. You are at the beginning of a more honest one. Sometimes the most painful chapters are the ones that lead us home.